appointed as what is referred to king over Israel. Now I want to pause here just a minute, as I have in most of these. I love names, and I keep saying that every single time, but once again I have to say that I love names. And Abimelech, the name, means his father is king. Now I don't know his name as he grew up. This may have lifted him up in a little bit of pride. So much so that he was desirous to go beyond what his father had said about the family not ruling over Israel. And once again, he was appointed, set up as what is called king over Israel. And as I thought about that, I thought, well, it really wasn't king of Israel. What he was at this point was king over Shechem and the area surrounding. Potentially, although his influence may have grown during the 3 years of his power, he was king of a small area surrounding his family land, the plot of ground where his family had grown up. In Judges 8:22, it was the men of Israel who wanted his father Gideon to rule over them. But in the Golden Truth, we see only the men of Shechem and Milo agreeing to Abimelech's reign. Abimelech was not the first self-appointed king of Israel, although that may have been his goal. That may have been what he desired. That may have been his ambition. He was simply a man who ruled over his extended family, even if he didn't do a very good job of it. He thought he could lift himself up out of his humble, illegitimate beginnings to become somebody better. But we read in Proverbs 16:18 and 19, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." In verse 19, "Better it is to be of an humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud." This is a universal truth that continues throughout time. Jesus said in Matthew 23 and 12, "And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted." Gideon, Abimelech's father before him, thought himself nothing, and yet he is mentioned among the cloud of witnesses in the 8th chapter of Hebrews. Abimelech, the king, on the other hand, thought to set himself up as king. But by his pride, that only lifted him up so that he had further to fall when his unstable foundation began to crumble from beneath him. As with every account within the pages of the Bible, this account was placed for our learning. No, he was not a judge, as the lesson points out. And he was barely a king by his own appointment. But by this account, we can see that nothing good will ever come from us trying to place ourselves in the body as we see fit. We don't have that authority. We don't have that power to say where we belong in the body of Christ. We don't have the authority to set ourselves up as a pastor, as a Sunday school teacher, as an ABM leader. We don't have that authority. But that's what we see happen here. This man thought he had the authority to set himself up as king. But it's only our humble submission to God, by our humble submission to God, that we can hope to achieve greatness that awaits all who will place their full trust and obedience in God's plans and not our own. We don't have the assurance of peace and fame and power in this life. But the true eternal rewards will be worth any humiliation that we have to face here on earth by our complete submission to God. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding his supposed kingship, there are a multitude of spiritual lessons to be gleaned from a study of his short time in power. The Golden Truth, Judges 9 and 6, "And all the men of Shechem gathered together, and all the house of Milo, and went and made Abimelech king by the plain of the pillar that was in Shechem. Part 1, disobedience, Judges 8:33. And it came to pass as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went whoring after Baalim, and made Baal-berith their god. Once again, and here I want to point out that it says very clearly in Judges 8:33, as soon as Gideon was dead. Not before he was dead, not while he was still alive, but as soon as Gideon was dead. At Gideon's death, immediately, Israel forgot and forsook God and began serving idols once again. Yet while Gideon was alive, Israel worshipped the golden ephod made by Gideon, from the spoils of war, and it became a snare unto him and his household. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what Judges 8:33 says. It says, as soon as Gideon was dead, the children of Israel turned again. So I'm sorry, got that little mistake in there. We will have to fix that, because I don't know, if someone could point me out where that commentary is right there, I'll gladly accept it. But it seems clear from the Bible that it says that it was after his death. I think his plans backfired on him. Talking about Gideon, his intentions, it seems, were good, trying to direct the people back to God and away from himself by creating this ephod. But his family ended up setting it up as an idol, and his children began to worship it. We read that because of Gideon's exploits, the land of Israel had peace for 40 years. If they had immediately worshiped the ephod, God would not have given them that 40 years of peace. They would have been put back into the hands of their enemies at once, and they would have never enjoyed that peace. It was after Gideon's death that this choice that he made to make this ephod became a snare to him. His name was tarnished because he had made the ephod, but it was his descendants who worshiped it. He died first. The Bible is very clear on this point. Once again, in Judges 8:33, it tells us that as soon as Gideon was dead. Now, they didn't wait long after his death, but it was as soon as Gideon was dead. Baal-berith is what they ended up calling the ephod. That means the God of the oath, or the God of the covenant. And that makes sense. That's the God that they were supposed to serve. But they were not supposed to serve God as a piece of gold. They were to serve Him as the one who cannot be made into an image. When God spoke to Israel from the top of the mountain, when He was giving them the 10 Commandments, He said, I've spoken to you. You've heard my voice, but you've seen no form. The reason that you've seen no form is because you can't make a golden image to me, because I am not imaginable. You couldn't even imagine what it would be like to make something that looks like me. I don't want you to make something that looks like me. I just want you to worship me. I'm here. You've heard my voice. You've seen the thunderings. You've seen the smoke and the quaking of the earth by my voice. That's my power. Worship me for who I am, and don't worship an idol in my place. But that's exactly what the children of Israel did here in this particular situation with Gideon. We read earlier in Judges 8:27, and Gideon made an ephod thereof, speaking of the gold that he gathered from people, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. It became a snare after his death, because by worshiping the ephod that he had made, his children tarnished the good name that he had earned through his faithfulness to God during his life. Once again, this is not during his lifetime. Even during the early days of the judges, Israel was bent on having a king. The men of Israel had tried to make Gideon king and to create a royal lineage to pass from him to his son and grandson after him. With wisdom, Gideon refused and reinforced to the nation that God was their ruler. They failed to take heed. The phrase, as soon as Gideon was dead, so the author even points it out here, indicates that the children of Israel as a whole had already had a desire in their hearts to turn away from God, since they had wanted a ruler in Gideon and his heirs. Israel did not resist Abimelech's reign. Well, those from Shechem and Milo didn't resist. My guess is, as an isolated incident, initially, the whole of Israel probably had no idea that this single person from what may not even have been an Israelite family was set up as king over a small area. It would have taken quite some time for the information to have spread. Part 2, punishment, oppression from within. Up to this point, the punishment for Israel's backsliding came at the hands of outside oppressors. This time, though, the oppressor actually rose up from among them. And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives, and his concubine that was in Shechem. She also bare him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. And Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, which is Gideon, went to Shechem unto his mother's brethren, and communed with them, and with all their family of the house of his mother's father, saying, Speak, I pray you, in the ears of all the men of Shechem, whether it is better for you either that all the sons of Jerubbaal, which are 70 persons, reign over you, or that one reign over you. Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's brethren spake of him in the ears of all the men of Shechem all these words. And their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our brother. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith. That's the ephod. Wherewith Abimelech hired vain and light persons. Now I want to stop here just for a second, because it says vain and light persons. What's that mean? Abimelech hired vain and light persons. Why? Once again, I love words, and I looked them up. Vain, in the original Hebrew there, is empty or idle or worthless. These were worthless men. Light, what's that word light? Well, were they skinny? Did they not weigh much? No, it's not what it meant. It meant wanton or reckless. Okay, well, what's wanton mean? Well, wanton has several definitions, but it's clear from the definition that in this particular instance, it means malicious, spiteful, wicked, cruel. So Abimelech hired worthless, wicked men to follow him. That's the crew that he had coming along behind him, following him and backing him up. He hired...
Sounds like President Trump's cabinet.
And he went unto his father's house at Ophrah, and slew his brethren, the sons of Jerubbaal, being 70 persons. Now, I don't know if anybody else picked up on this, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that the money he received was the same as the number of his brothers. He had 70 brothers, and he got 70 pieces of money, pieces of silver. That's 70. 70 brothers, 70 pieces of silver. A single piece of silver for each of his brothers whom he was to kill. What he had done is he had hired some very, very cheap assassins. These men also must have been seeking their own glory, since the money he raised to supply himself with an army, that was a very small amount. Now, you talk about a piece of silver. That's what an average laborer makes in a day. That's not big money. Whatever it is you make in your regular job when you're working, or if you're working now, that's about what he paid these men to follow him. And they were willing to go. It wasn't a whole lot. Maybe, I could look at it just thinking about maybe $80, $8,500. And they're going to follow this man and kill all his brothers for $80, $85. That's definitely some vain and light men, in my opinion. They're not concerned with any good, for sure. They probably recognized the ambitions of Abimelech and desired to be close to this man who was hoping to reign over all of Israel. Brother Rick pointed out here just a minute ago, you want to get close to those people who have the ability to lift you up. You want to, they call it, rub elbows with those people. You want to get close to them in this world, by this world's mindset, because by that, you can be lifted up out of your position. You may be considered a vain and light man by the people who surround you. But if you can associate yourself with someone who's better, then you have the potential to lift yourself up. You have the potential to become more highly recognized in the society, while certainly not more highly favored before God. We see this happening all around us in our nation today. There are those who what's their claim to fame? They knew somebody. They were friends with somebody. They had a relationship with somebody who gave them an opportunity to make something out of themselves. This is not the ambition that we need to seek as servants of the Lord. We need to seek to rub elbows with God. If we're going to rub elbows with any bigwigs, we need to recognize that the Holy Spirit is the one we need to be closest to. We need to be close to Him so that we can recognize the place that God would have us to be placed in this body. Because it's not about finding glory for ourselves. If we seek our own glory, the Bible tells us we're not wise. But if we seek God's glory, He will lift us up. We just read earlier, Jesus said, if we abase ourselves, we'll be lifted up. God will give us what we need. But if we lift ourselves up, we will fall. We will struggle, and it's not going to work out so well for us as we might imagine. Yes?
Those that we rub elbows with are the ones that we become like.
That's right.
If we're rubbing elbows with the Lord, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to become more like Christ.
That's exactly right.
If we're out in the world rubbing elbows with the world, these things. I've been watching a little bit on Prince Harry getting ready to get married. And right now she's rubbing elbows with royalty. Pretty soon she's going to be part of the royal family because she's rubbing elbows and getting ready to get married. She's going to become like them.
Mm-hmm.
At one point she was basically nobody. And then she became, working TV. But now she's going to become royalty because she's rubbing elbows with royalty. But we need to rub elbows with the supreme royalty of this world, which is the Lord.
Absolutely. There will always be those who seek their own honor. There will always be those who seek to lift themselves up above their current position. But these are promised a position among the proud in their destruction. We read in Proverbs 25 and 27, "It is not good to eat much honey. So for men to search out their own glory is not glory." Now, I don't know about you, but I love honey. But you can only take so much before it'll mess you up. It'll make you sorry you had it. God knows just exactly what we need to become and what He would have us to be. The only help He needs from us is our willingness to submit ourselves to His will. If we try to help God in any other way, we're only going to hinder our own spiritual walk. We're only going to hinder the spiritual walk of those around us whom we hope to benefit by where we are in the service of the Lord. Sometimes, it's not always the most glamorous thing to be in God's will. Who in this building has found it glamorous to be a part of God's will? Anybody? Anybody? No? No? Okay. Well, sometimes it's not even pleasant to be found in God's will. But we can rest comfortably in the certainty that our obedience will bring blessings both to us and to those who follow our good example. There's reason. God has given us hope. And it's a hope that this world can't supply us with. These men who followed Abimelech, they were following vain hope. The best they could hope for was to be a part of the cabinet of this ruler for a little while. And then, what? What's the benefit beyond that? We know, looking at this lesson, we know, looking back anyway, that we can see clearly that his reign only lasted 3 years. So these men may have rubbed elbows with a bigwig, so to speak. But what happened after that? What happened after Abimelech was gone? There was nothing left to support them. They were relying on the power of man. They were looking to Abimelech to lift them up to positions of power. Now Abimelech was gone. And they had no power to keep themselves up. And once again, and he went unto his father's house at Ophrah and slew his brethren, the sons of Jerubbaal, being 70 persons upon one stone. Notwithstanding yet, Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left. For he hid himself, and all the men of Shechem gathered together, and all the house of Milo, and went and made Abimelech king. Once again, I feel it important to note here that this was a very small group who proclaimed Abimelech king. This was not kingship over all of Israel, but a small local kingship over a very small portion of the children of Israel. And as I studied out a little bit, this was one of the most difficult lessons I've had to study. The people of Shechem and Milo, they weren't Israelites. There may have been some Israelites there. I couldn't even find for sure whether it was the land of Manasseh or Ephraim, because there were some places where I read it was the land of Ephraim. Some places I read it was the land of Manasseh. But what was certain was those people who were of Shechem were still living in that place even while Israel moved in. So that it's not even clear by any biblical record, biblical account, whether Abimelech's mother was even an Israelite. We can't say that with any certainty, because it only says that Gideon had a concubine who came from Shechem. It doesn't say that it was an Israelite from Shechem. It doesn't say that it was one of the sons of Hamor, who are actually the Shechemites. And the thing of it is, when you talk about the Shechemites, are you talking about the people who come from Shechem because that's where they lived? Are you talking about the Shechemites, the people who actually came from Shechem, the person who was not an Israelite, but who was an enemy of the Israelites, who was an Hivite? They made Abimelech king by the plain of the pillar that was in Shechem. Judges 8, 30, 31, 9 and 1 through 6. And 9, 1 through 6. Gideon, also referred to as Jerubbaal and Jerubbesheth, had 70 sons by many wives, plus one son, Abimelech, by a concubine, also referred to as his maidservant. At his father's death, Abimelech returned to his mother's village of Shechem in the land of Israel and rallied support for himself to be ruler. Abimelech convinced the men of Shechem, who in turn convinced others to back him as king. And he received 70 pieces of silver, financing made possible by idol worship, which he used to hire followers. Abimelech returned to his father's hometown of Ophrah and murdered all but one of his 70 brothers. Now, I have to point out here that it seems to have been common practice in the times of kings throughout history, throughout the world, in order to secure the position of king, a ruler would annihilate his family. This would ensure that no one would come up later with a proper claim to the throne. Now, if you look at the children of Gideon specifically here, you see that the 70 sons that he had were his legitimate children. The one who reigned was an illegitimate child. By that, he didn't have the right to rule in the first place, according to the custom of the time. Especially in this instance, this practice would seem necessary, since Abimelech held the most tenuous connections to his father because of his illegitimate birth. Now, illegitimate birth may be overlooked in modern society, but then this man would have been a complete outcast. His claim to both his father, Gideon, and his position within his mother's family were his only hope for his self-empowered success. All the more reason to destroy those whose lineage was more firmly rooted in the propriety of the day. It seems reasonable to think that even if the rest of Israel could have heard that there was a local king within the confines of a small city or region, they would never accept him as king of a nation because of his illegitimate beginnings. Not to mention the possibility that his mother might not even have been a Jew, which would make him completely incapable of taking the throne according to the Word of God. They may have been steeped in paganism and searching for a king, but this is not likely one that they would have accepted on a general level in Israel. Either way, his untimely death renders anything we might suppose could have happened irrelevant. God took him out of the way before he could cause any more harm than he did. I don't want that ever to be said of me, that God had to take me out of the way. Lord, help me not to be in your way. Help me to be a part of your will and not separate from your will. God, help me to be, as David, recognize my own sins and separate myself from them so that they don't destroy me. That's exactly what happened here in the case of Abimelech. His sins got out of hand. His sin became so big that it caused his downfall. It caused his destruction. We might say this day that he was turned over to a reprobate mind. He didn't even recognize that the things that he was doing were wrong. He had no understanding of any improper activity on his own behalf. He couldn't see it. Lord, help me to always see. If I start to go out of line, if I start to think of myself more highly than I should, help me to see and surrender myself to God fully so that He can bring me back from the pits of destruction. Just looking at David once again, David had the opportunity to fail on multiple occasions without recourse. But what made David a man after God's own heart? It wasn't the fact that he never sinned. That's clear. His life was far from perfect. But what made him a man after God's own heart was his recognition of his own failures, his willingness to admit his wrongdoing and seek God's will. That's where we have to be. That's the reason we have people like Abimelech in the Bible, to point out, you go ahead and lift yourself up. This is what's going to happen to you. But when we allow ourselves to remain humble in God's will and surrendered to Him, then He'll lift us up. We may not become kings. We may not become pastors or overseers or something that we look at as something that might be considered special. But it's not important for me to be special in your eyes. If you don't think I'm the greatest teacher in the world, I don't care. I'm doing God's will here. If I'm pleasing God, that's good enough for me. That's all that matters to me. I'm not here to please anybody else. But I've been placed in this position by God. I didn't say, Sister Betty, Sister Doris, I think you guys, since you guys have been the Sunday school superintendents, I think you should make me a teacher. And Sister Doris, when I started here, the first thing I did, I came and I said, I'd love to be a teacher more than anything in this world. No, that's not the way it happened. God used His path to put me in the place where I am today. Because if Sister Doris knew me, if Sister Betty really knew me, they'd have never put me in teaching. Because they'd have known, he doesn't want to get in front of people. He's behind the scenes kind of guy. And I like behind the scenes. I like not being the center of attention. But if that's not God's will for my life, I'm going to do what He says. Because I know I'm going to benefit. I'm going to benefit. And Lord willing, if I'm submitted to God, others will benefit as well. By my submission, not by lifting myself up to a position, but by submitting myself to God's will, souls will be benefited. Let's see where I am here. Sorry. Part B, warning sounded. Judges 9, 7 through 21 says, "And when they told it Jotham, he went and stood in the top of Mount Gerizim and lifted up his voice and cried and said unto them, Hearken unto me, ye men of Shechem, that ye may hearken, that God may hearken unto you." I do find it important here to note that Jotham only addresses the men of Shechem when he pronounces this curse of Abimelech's impending failure as king. He only addresses the men of Shechem. "The trees went forth on a time to anoint a king over them, and they said unto the olive tree, Reign thou over us. But the olive tree said unto them, Should I leave my fatness wherewith by me they honor God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees? And the tree said unto the fig tree, Come thou and reign over us. But the fig tree said unto them, Should I forsake my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to be promoted over the trees? Then said the trees unto the vine, Come thou and reign over us. And the vine said unto them, Should I leave my wine Should I leave my wine which cheereth God and man, and go to be promoted over the trees? Then said all the trees unto the bramble, Come thou and reign over us. And the bramble said unto the trees, If in truth ye anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow. And if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now therefore, if ye have done truly and sincerely, and that ye have made Abimelech king, and if ye have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done unto him according to the deserving of his hands. For my father fought for you, and adventured his life far, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. And ye are risen up against my father's house this day, and have slain his sons, 70 persons upon one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his maidservant, king over the men of Shechem." Once again it says, what did Jotham, the son of Gideon, the true son of Gideon, say? Made Abimelech king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. "If ye then have dealt truly and sincerely with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice ye in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and the house of Milo," because those are the ones over whom he was king. "And let fire come out of the men of Shechem and from the house of Milo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother." God used Jotham, the sole survivor of a tiny remnant of Gideon's lineage, to cry out a warning from a rocky mountaintop in Palestine. Yeah, a tiny remnant, one, that's a pretty tiny remnant. He spoke in the form of a parable using trees. He compared Abimelech to the bramble, a thorn tree, not fit to rule. The most unworthy to rule had enticed them to their soon and certain destruction. After Jotham finished speaking, he fled to safety for fear of his brother. Part 3, Reign of Terror. The account does not indicate Israel cried out to the Lord in repentance, perhaps because they were apathetic, or perhaps as a nation they were unaware of the situation unfolding in a small corner of the vast multitude of the people of Israel. News traveled slowly, and Abimelech could have been dead before the entire nation even knew what had occurred. While his influence may have spread, it is unlikely that he ever ruled over all of Israel. When Abimelech had reigned 3 years over Israel, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the cruelty done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood be laid upon Abimelech their brother, which slew them, and upon the men of Shechem, which aided him in the killing of his brethren. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he took the city and slew the people that was therein, and beat down the city, and sowed it with salt. And all the people likewise cut down every man his bow, and followed Abimelech, and put them to the hold, and set the hold on fire upon them, so that all the men of the tower of Shechem died also, about 1,000 men and women. Then went Abimelech to Thebes, and camped against Thebes, and took it. After 3 years, Abimelech and the men who brought him to power began to be at odds one with another, and fighting ensued. Isn't that a perfect example of what happens when we try to take our own destinies into our hands? It may seem good at first, but eventually our past will come up to haunt us. He did reign for a little while. He did have that authority and power that he so desperately sought, for a little while. But we read in Numbers 32 and 23, be sure that your sin will find you out. It always does. No matter how hard we may try to hide it, no matter what we may have done, no matter in this life or in the next, we cannot escape our past or the knowledge of our God. There's nothing we can do that will hide us from the understanding that God has of the choices that we've made in this life. His plans may seem harder, but remember the choice that Lot made and how it turned out for him. When Abraham said, you take whichever direction you want, I'll go the other way. Lot said, whew, I got lots of cattle. There's a lot of grass that way. I'm going that way. Abraham, you fend for yourself. You do whatever you have to. I'm going to take the green route. Now remember how Abraham was willing to take the path which God had chosen for him. It may have been a lot more difficult. He may have stumbled along the way. But in the end, he too became a member of that faithful cloud of witnesses from Hebrews chapter 11. The straight and narrow path is not a path for the faint of heart. We are all called to count the cost. When we look at these biblical accounts and compare them to our own history, we can see a clear reflection. When we trust God, He takes us through the trials for His glory and our benefit. But when we seek our own paths, trouble lies ahead. Can anybody testify to that? Can anybody agree that that's exactly the way it is? When we seek our own way, it doesn't turn out so well, but when we trust God, things work out a lot better. Pride has a tendency to let us down. But if we will look to God, He will reveal the beauty of our misery. Because often it's not until we hit the bottom that we begin to look up for Him to help. Pride can destroy us. But if we look to God when we fall, He will lift us up into His will if we let Him. Abimelech and his army began to make their way from city to city, destroying towns and killing many people. Abimelech destroyed the city of Shechem and sowed the ground with salt, rendering it unproductive. Then, in fulfillment of the words spoken by Jotham, used fire to kill about 1,000 of the men and women of Shechem. Deliverance, Judges 9:53. And a certain woman cast a piece of a millstone upon Abimelech's head, and all to break his skull. Abimelech took the city of Thebes, but failed to take the strong tower within, where many people fled for protection. Interestingly, God used an unnamed woman to stop Abimelech's reign of terror when she cast a piece of millstone from the tower to break his skull. In his final humiliation, he is rendered helpless and at the point of death by a woman. Surely this was the final blow to this man's inflated ego. He wasn't killed immediately, because then he would have had no knowledge of the one who brought him back down to earth from the lofty height which he sought for himself. If we continue to seek our own way, we have the assurance of our own eventual humility. We can humble ourselves under God's mighty hand, or He will show us humiliation as we can't even imagine. God's plan always works for our good. Why not submit ourselves to Him and trust His will for our lives? Everybody benefits when we do. Everybody sees the benefit. Part 5, spirit of apathy. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man to his place. And the spirit of apathy, prominent during the time of Abimelech, seems to have continued after his death. As soon as the men of Israel the men of Shechem saw that he was dead, they simply went to their own homes. There is no mention of a change in their attitudes of remorse or repentance or turning back to the Lord. Part 6, application for today. Present-day applications from the account of Abimelech are numerous. Let not anyone pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing, John Stuart Mills. This mindset still brings devastation today. Look at the state of our own nation, and we can clearly see the results of this behavior. We are called to be active participants and not simply spectators. I think we heard that recently here in this building. It will only be our participation in God's plan that we and others will receive the blessings which God has in store for us. We are God's hands and feet here on earth. If we are faithful, God will be seen working in and through His servants, and others will be inspired to act similarly. 2, the enemy can work from the outside, but may also rise up from within. Compare the account of Abimelech with the warning for the church from Acts 20, 29, and 30. For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. As I've said before, Satan is not content to cause one member to backslide and leave the church. He wants double agents who attend church regularly, yet are not fully sold out to God. Through these, he can divide congregations. He can plant seeds of heresy. He can hinder spiritual growth, and he can diminish our ability to draw potential new members. This kind of activity is our adversary's perfect weapon. This indifference will cause it to be much easier for grievous wolves to enter in among us. When our eyes are focused on who said or did what, we will overlook more important things. When the enemy has our attention on checking off our holiness checklist, we will be more apt to point out the failures of others rather than understanding our own failures. Look at the Pharisees and Sadducees. Also consider the followers of Jesus in the days leading up to Pentecost. They were all in one accord, and their only concern was God's will. These 120 souls reach farther in a few years without any modern conveniences than we have since the reorganization. When God is our focus, nothing will slip past us. People with a thirst for power will use the weaknesses of others for their own benefit. Sadly, we've probably experienced this firsthand in our own lives. As a woman in the strong tower used what she was familiar with, a millstone for grinding wheat, so should we use what we know, our talents and abilities for the work of the Lord. Not reaching beyond our grasp, but seeking God's will and knowing whatever it is that He's put before us, it's possible. It's still a personal choice to call upon the Lord for deliverance. Let's skip down here a little bit. However, as the soil of Shechem bore repercussions long after the salt was sown by Abimelech, we too often bear the result of allowing the enemy to control us long after we have been redeemed. We are still responsible for the actions of our pasts after we get saved. Prisoners are not set free when they confess Jesus Christ as their Savior. Brother Rick, you know anybody in your prison ministry when they decide to get saved, the prison just let them free? Nope. Okay, well, still responsible for those past actions. Neither are the accused acquitted before they go to trial for the profession of Christ. The lasting mental and physical effects of drugs and alcohol will still affect saved individuals. Christians have died of lung cancer and cirrhosis long after those habits were broken by God's power and mercy. Any other number of continuing troubles are not erased by salvation. But in salvation, we have the assurance that these things will work together for our good if we will simply keep our eyes on God. We are made overcomers by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. These testimonies that we have, while sometimes embarrassing, have the power to tear down the walls between us and the lost whom we hope to reach for the Lord. Through our past failures and the victory we've received through God's mercy, others can have hope of similar outcome to what may feel like an impossible situation. I know there was a time when I was in an impossible situation in my own life, and I saw no hope. But someone came to me and they said, I understand your situation. I said, you can't understand my situation. I said, yes, I can. I've been where you are now. And by that, I had hope. There are people out in the world today who are facing things that we've already overcome. And it's by our testimony that they can become overcomers as well. We must not allow pride to destroy us, but we must allow the Lord to use what we have received in our own lives to be a blessing to those around us, to reach out to the lost and make a difference in their lives.